Welcome to Workplace Wake Up, your go-to podcast for practical employment law guidance. I'm Jennifer Shaw, the founder of Shaw Law Group, and I'm here to help HR professionals and leaders navigate the legal minefield of the modern workplace. Each week, we tackle real-world issues with clear advice and a little tough love. Let's get started. Thank you so much for joining me today for the podcast. I kind of feel like spring is in the air. It's really a beautiful day here in Sacramento, and we have a blue sky, and all the trees are blooming, and it's just gorgeous. So I know for some of you, it's still freezing, but I think we might be getting a little close to spring here in Sacramento. So what are we talking about here today? If you have ever sat in your office as an HR professional thinking, I would not be dealing with this issue if that manager had just called me first, if that supervisor had just let me know what was going on, if that leader had just brought me into the discussion so I could actually help them strategize and develop a good response, this episode is for you. Because you know what? Most legal exposure does not come from a policy that was poorly written or some rogue employee. Look, the policy is important for sure, but the reason there's usually an issue is because a leader, a manager, a supervisor, the executive director, the chief, whoever it may be, made an everyday decision that they really didn't realize was risky, right? That is what we're going to focus on here in this episode. Lawsuits generally start with one leader, right? One manager, one supervisor simply saying the wrong thing. Now, why is that? Because here's the thing. I think most managers, supervisors, leaders, they have really good intentions, right? They want to do the right thing. They care about their employees. They work really hard on team building and collaboration and wanting to make sure that everyone has a fair opportunity to succeed in the workplace. And they really have good thoughts and good intentions about what they want to be doing. The problem is we don't always have great instincts. And many times we are not given any training in employment law realities, right? As managers and supervisors. I mean, I know when I first became a partner at my former law firm, I suddenly had to manage people a lot more than I ever had before. Nobody told me how to do that. I didn't know what it meant to give someone a performance evaluation really, or how to deal with an attendance issue, or what to do when somebody was clearly calling it in, right? Just quietly quitting and doing the minimum that they could possibly get away with. Nobody ever told me how to deal with that. And I think that is a big miss that we have in the workplace these days. We do so much required training, right? We talk about equal employment opportunity issues and safety at work and how to manage minors to make sure they're getting what they need and we don't overwork them and they work at the right time of the day so they don't violate any of their work permits, right? We have all this training that we do. But the day-to-day skill of just leading, of interacting with folks to whom you're giving direction and you need them to actually do something, we just don't cover those topics as well as we could. And I think what happens is we forget that these leaders are human beings, right? They're going to have reactions, they're going to have viewpoints, they're going to have perspectives. And if we don't help guide them a little bit, and we just assume that everybody has, common sense, which of course does not exist, right? There's no such thing. We weren't all raised the same way. We don't all have the same viewpoints. We don't all have the same perspectives. It's just one of those things that we really, I think, forget sometimes how important it is to give leaders some help, to guide them, and to do everything we can to make sure they are not the weak link, right, in our workplace sort of compliance efforts. So there are a couple things that over my 30 plus years, I've heard a lot of leaders say, or do that really put their employers in a terrible spot. And one of my favorite is, I was just being honest, right? So a manager or supervisor will say something completely inappropriate. And then when questioned about it, they will simply say, well, that was how I really felt about it. That's what I really thought. That was my true perspective. Are you saying I don't have a right to share my views? Well, as I tell people sometimes when they're sent to me for one-on-one training, when they've had some issues, hey, you can be yourself, but being yourself might be an expensive proposition. You may need to tweak things a little bit if you don't want to be in a situation where you are literally creating liability for your employer, which of course is going to have two consequences, right? Number one, the employer is going to spend money they don't want to spend. And number two, there's not going to be a real reason to keep you around if you're costing them more money than you're making them, right? There's just this obvious recognition that you may be too much trouble, okay? So when I hear leaders say things like, I was just being honest, I know right away that no one has ever sat them down and told them, hey, listen, some things you might want to say should stay in your head. These should be inside thoughts. These should not be things that actually come out of your mouth or things that you actually do. You might think about them, you might consider them, but you won't actually do them if you take a few minutes to think about what the consequences might be. Another greatest hit of a manager mistake that I see a lot is treating similar situations very differently. So think of it this way. Let's assume I have a male employee who I adore. He is a hard worker. He comes to work on time. He does everything I ask him to do. He actually goes beyond many times. Now, he's also a little sloppy, okay? He doesn't proofread his work. It takes me a little extra time to go through his work product. It probably is inefficient because he needs to spend more time on his own looking at his work. But he's so good at so many other things that I let it go. And I give him glowing evaluations. And then I have a female employee who she writes pretty well. She catches her errors, but she's so annoying. She's always complaining and she's very self-righteous and she never admits that she's made a mistake when she does. And she's just not fun to work with. Every time she comes to work late or makes a mistake, I write her up because I am hoping that one day HR will tell me I've got enough on this woman to get rid of her. Okay? Both employees are behaving similarly in terms of having some performance issues that are a problem, right? Whether it's attendance or not catching your own errors or not being careful in what you're doing. But I am not treating them consistently because of my personal feelings, right? I like the male employee more. I think overall he brings more to the table. So I let things go that I will not let go for the female employee. Okay, that is the definition of discrimination. That is not going to fly anywhere, let alone California. I know we will have our own views about the people with whom we work, but again, those are inside thoughts. You have got to treat everybody fairly and consistently. And I know most of you listening to this podcast are rolling your eyes right now thinking, okay, well, that's pretty obvious, Jen. Thanks for sharing. But you would not believe, or maybe you would, how often this gets messed up. Because it's like these leaders lose their minds, right? They forget, hey, you don't think people compare notes? You don't think people can see that you're being so much nicer to the male employee, Jen? Come on, of course people know. You have to treat similarly situated people the same. That's all there is to it, or at least consistently. Here's another thing managers love to do. We talk. Talk. Don't do this, don't do that. You should do this, you should do that. And we don't write a bloody bit of it down. And I like to say, if it's not written down, folks, it didn't happen. It just didn't. You've got to have the documentation. I don't care how many verbal conversations you've had. If you didn't write down what the heck is going on, it is irrelevant. You've got to make sure you are documenting. So these are the kinds of mistakes that I see all the time. And I know those of you who are in HR roles, you see these things too. And then what ends up happening is all of these problems come to HR, and HR is supposed to clean up the mess, right? So you have these offhanded comments or this semi-inappropriate conduct that actually turns into retaliation allegations or harassment allegations or discrimination claims, or somebody says that the manager failed to accommodate their disability or their medical condition or their religious belief or practice. And you're left holding the bag in HR, right? You're left trying to figure out, how am I going to fix this problem? What am I going to do? All right, well, one of the things we could and should do is back up the bus, right? We've got to do training. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago, that we've got to make sure that leaders get the training they need to really understand what is going on at work. What are the parameters? What are the sort of bumpers, right? I think about bowling. I'm a terrible bowler and those little bumpers come up, right? It keeps me from having a gutter ball. We want to avoid gutter balls at all costs, right? So do as much training as you can. But listen, you can't train on everything. So what I want you to think about is coaching. How are you going to coach your leaders without losing them? It's not by blaming them. It's not by humiliating them. It's not by making them feel like they're incompetent. It's by being a partner, sitting down with them and say, listen, compliance is protection. When I tell you to document, that's because it will protect you and it will protect the company and it will protect our employees, all of whom matter to this organization, right? So we've got to create a culture where everybody understands, look, we are trying to do the right thing. Will we always succeed? Will it be perfect? No. But there's one thing we can do that I think really helps in this area. I want you to teach your leaders to do what I call pause and check. Pause and check. Take a moment to think through what is going on and what you want to do, and check yourself for just a second and think about what is the right thing to do here. I'm one of those folks who, when I see a problem, I want it to be solved right now, right? I want it to be done. So I want to get up there, I want to solve the problem, and I want to make sure that the problem is handled, right? So I can move on to the other million things I have on my desk. The problem is, what that leads me to do sometimes is act too quickly without thinking things through. So I want us to think about pause and check. Take a moment. If you're not sure what to do, the right thing to do is nothing. Take a minute. I don't mean you take 3 weeks to figure this out. But if you react emotionally, if you respond without having thought through what is really going on and making sure you have all the information and making sure that you're being fair and making sure that you're not misjudging a situation because of your personal feelings, you will make mistakes, and your leaders will not catch this if you don't help them understand. Here's the deal, you guys. You don't need leaders who think like lawyers, right? I'm not asking them to think about how a claim might be brought or what the elements of a hostile work environment complaint may be. I want you to train your managers and your leaders and your supervisors to know when not to wing it, when they need to take a breath, when they need to pause and check and really think about, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? How could this be misperceived? How's the employee going to take this? How's it going to land for them? And of course, a big part of that is looping in HR, making sure that we get to human resources. We get to the right folks. And I know for some of you, you don't have an HR department. You have a person who wears an HR hat an hour a day. I get it. That's fine. No problem. Not everybody can have an HR team, right? So the reality is you got to think about, okay, where do you want these leaders to go when they need to run something by another individual who's a little less emotionally involved, who's a little less frustrated, right? And if we give them that outlet, if we create a way, a place for these leaders to be able to address those situations, they're not going to be up at night worrying about them. They're not going to be making decisions hastily. They're not going to be saying things that they regret. If we take the time to really coach them and really help them understand how to approach these situations with a little more thought and a little more strategy and a little more planning, we are going to be way ahead of the game in terms of preventing potential liability. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me here today. Go out and do something nice for someone, and I will see you next time. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Workplace Wake Up. If you found today's discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with your HR and leadership teams. For more insights, training programs, and legal updates, you can visit us at shawlawgroup.com.